Voilà. Oui. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's just wait another 2 or 3 minutes and then we'll start. Thank you very much for being here. I think it will be an interesting evening with a beautiful panel, very learned people that know what they're talking about. So let's wait another 2 minutes or so that everything settles down. And we have all the panelists there. Great, beautiful. We're all wearing a tie. Isn't that beautiful? Except for Anissa. Okay. I do have a question. Do we have to sit on the World Report? Well, I'm sure you have all read it. You know, it's 538 pages, overnight. Beautiful. Well, after all, if everybody, the panels is full. Again, thank you very much for being here. Thank you. I will introduce the members of the panel. First of all, can you hear me? Okay, everybody, can you hear me? Is the sound good enough? Apparently, yes. Okay. Each one of you will have a... No, I don't think each one of you will have... you will have to use the microphone. Okay, this evening is for your benefit, and I always make sure that, you know, this is an open discussion, no major statement, and I do want to give you a chance to ask all the questions that come in your minds during the second period of this special evening. Well, this is the second year of the World War Report. We've had one last year, very interesting one. As far as a journalist, I was, of course, very interested in knowing that some people were working on the classification of armed conflicts and the notion of international armed conflicts, non-international armed conflicts. And this kind of report really helps us in the media to make things understood, you know, and you, of course, all know that these days it is difficult to even ourselves to understand really what's going on and try and pretend that we do give a good explanation. So this evening, I think I will learn a lot from your questions and from their answers. Well, again, thank you to the people that have accepted the invitation of the Academy. May I present you all the panelists. Robert Rondt, qui est là. Thank you very much. And you told me that you are the one who wrote the whole thing. Thank you. When did you take your function here? In 1st of August. Are you still here? No. You're not leaving yet? Good. You like it? It'll depend. Okay, thank you, Robert. And you will be given the floor just in a while to sort of sum up what's in the report. Anissa Bellal, thank you. Anissa Bellal is a legal person. I've had a chance to interview her on the Géopolitis program on Swiss television and TV5 Monde a while ago. She's very good. She works for the Geneva Call organization. Christophe Haynes, who is special rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions. So, you know, all of you, of course, are familiar with the Council of Human Rights in Geneva. And so you are the person who knows what should be said on extrajudicial executions. You're a person of reference, and we're happy to have you with us tonight. Thank you. And to my left, of course, is Stéphane Ojeda from the ICRC, Comité International de la Croix-Rouge, Deputy Head of Operations for the Americas region. Of course, everybody knows what happened yesterday in Washington with the another report on torture. And as we were very, excited about knowing what was going on, and I think we'll have a chance, because this is part of armed conflicts. I think we do need to talk about torture and what can be done about it. And of course, we all notice that at least on a democratic basis, certainly it feels good that one country is eager enough to have a report of the Parliament on such an issue as torture, and we'll have a chance to talk about this. To my left, too, is Fabrizio Gariglia, who's director. Let's make this very clear. He does not represent the ICC. He represents the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC, la Cour Pénale Internationale en français. You know quite a bit about prosecution, and we do have a lot of questions about the prosecution, the ICC, of course, related to Africa, related to the role of the ICC, of its capacities. It will be very interesting to hear your point of view. And to my left, a colleague from Al Jazeera English. You're based in Doha. You work very often in London. And you are the director of Al Jazeera English, pretty well-known channel, of course. We share some experience because quite a while ago we were both in Doha. He was the manager. I was just a visitor from Switzerland. When Al Jazeera first started, and that's the time when Mubarak, remember Mubarak, whoever he was, and Mubarak came to Doha and had the chance to see Al Jazeera, and he said, how could such a small, a matchbox, light up the whole world? And I think he was right. So you do have, probably you have, like me, you have a lot of questions to ask to the panel. But we do need some opening remarks. What are we talking about? How can Switzerland play a role in that part of the armed conflicts and, of course, of the armed conflict resolution? So I would like to call Ambassador Schmidt from the Swiss mission. Ambassador, you have the floor on those opening remarks, and we count on you to make things a little clearer so that you can tell us what exactly the points of discussions are. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, I thank you very much, Xavier, and I hope to contribute with clarity and not the opposite. But let me start by welcoming you all, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, naturally most distinguished panelists. And I have to say that I'm very pleased to be amongst you today for this official launch of the second edition of the Geneva Academy's War Report, or just short, the War Report 2013, and the newly updated Rule of Law in Armed Conflict, the so-called RULAC database. And I must say that I'm not only pleased, but I'm also proud that Switzerland is amongst the main supporters and sponsors of these unique publications. Just like last year, today's event coincides with the celebration of the Human Rights Day, commemorating the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the General Assembly of the United Nations. As trivial as this might be, such coincidence reminds us that armed conflicts constantly interfere with the victims' full enjoyment of their human rights. As the legal regime applicable to armed conflicts, international humanitarian law, IHL, provides both adequate protection to the victims and necessary limits to the conduct of hostilities. One should, however, be careful not to apply IHL to situations other than armed conflicts. As we are all well aware, IHL indeed authorizes conducts that international human rights law considers unlawful. Let me, for instance, mention the internment of prisoners of war or the killing of a civilian directly participating in hostilities. Consequently, one must not stretch the notion of armed conflict to cover other situations of violence, such as the so-called war on terror, to which IHL is not applicable. Classifying a situation as an armed conflict is not insignificant. To the contrary, such classification triggers the applicability of IHL and thus bears many consequences. First, it determines whether a specific conduct amounts to a war crime and is a fortiori subject to the jurisdiction of national and or international criminal tribunals. Second, it is decisive for the ICRC's fulfillment of its mandate. Third, it can determine whether the International Humanitarian Fact-Finding Commission, a mechanism established under Article 90 of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, is competent. Fourth, it is relevant to the conduct of operations by international organizations, such as the United Nations. And not at last, this classifying exercise is even of particular importance to Switzerland, as it constitutes the first step in assessing whether the rules pertaining to neutrality are applicable or not. The classification of a given situation as an armed conflict is technically based on factual elements only. In practice, it is nonetheless, and unfortunately, greatly influenced by political considerations. Indeed, parties to a conflict often tend to either downplay or exaggerate the situation, depending on whether they see benefits from the application of IHL or not. This tendency particularly affects non-international armed conflicts, in other words, civil wars, since the legal requirements triggering IHL are not necessarily very precise. Some situations of violence may thus not be classified as easily as one would hope. The second edition of the War Report continues identifying and analyzing armed conflicts around the globe by focusing on the year 2013. That year was again characterized by a prevalence of non-international armed conflicts, confirming the ongoing profound change in the nature of warfare. It also saw the end of 5 armed conflicts and the emergence of 8 new ones, notably in Mali, in Nigeria, and in Syria. Besides classifying a total of 39 situations, the War Report also provides essential contextual information and relevant underlying issues on each of them. Finally, the War Report devotes an entire section to important topical issues related to the armed conflicts ongoing in 2013. For example, new weapons, policies and trends in warfare, sexual violence against men and boys, the recruitment of child soldiers, and the additional need for protection of the disabled. The second edition of the Geneva Academy's War Report once again provides priceless information based on independent and impartial legal research and analysis. The same goes for the newly updated and redesigned RULAC database. It aims at classifying situations in real time and thus at being complementary to the War Report, which is only published retroactively. Both instruments will undoubtedly be useful to both jurists and policymakers amongst governments, international organizations, national and international criminal jurisdictions, NGOs, and academic institutions. To conclude, I would like to sincerely congratulate all the editors, authors, and contributors of both the War Report 2013 and the RULAC database. I am convinced that those complementary instruments will contribute to challenging our thinking, inspiring our assessment, and steering our action. I'm therefore glad to cede the floor to the moderator of today's event, Xavier Collin, and to the distinguished panelists, and I would like to thank you for your presence and your most appreciated interest in this subject. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Schmid. And you referred to the RULAC. Of course, what you see back there is the frame of the new site that has been working for the last 24 hours. So all you have to do is go there on RULAC and click on every country that is interesting. I realized that the people working here at the Academy are nearly as good as we are on television. It's a good competition. Maybe they'll do our work someday. We'll watch that. Okay, Robert Roth, I'd like to ask you one question. Last year, when we started the discussion, all of a sudden we had a chance to talk about Mexico and say there is a war in Mexico. And we noticed that at the time, if you had gone in the street and asked the people, is there a war in Mexico? They would have said, no, I haven't heard about a war in Mexico. Now they have. They have, with all the civilians that are being killed, the students. And then, okay, that was I would say, one way to approach the report last year, making the difference between an international armed conflict and should we call it national or inside armed conflict. Now, in this second report, we go further. One thing, out of 30 armed conflicts, only 2 are international conflicts, which is good news, but 28 are non-international conflicts. Is it bad news? Is it bad news only? Is it a way to solve the problem to classify those wars?
Sorry, I didn't.
It works. Don't worry.
Thank you for the question. Hello to everybody. First of all, I would like to pay tribute to the people who have who have written this report. Essentially, Dr. Stewart.
He's somewhere in the audience.
Kazim Eslen, who is here, but is also in the room, and he can naturally intervene later in the discussion. And all the people, including my neighbor, Isabella, I think she's the only one on the panel who has contributed to this report.
About Central Africa.
About Central Africa. I would like to underline, elaborating on what the ambassador said, that one of the things which have impressed me in the report, when I took my position, the report was already ready, so it's not my contribution, my personal contribution, is the wide range of essays, as was mentioned by the ambassador, on various topics, including very neglected topics like the protection of disabilities in armed conflict, and more naturally, other topics which are in the public debate, like drones, chemical weapons, etc., etc. And you rarely have a book with this range, such a wide range of essays, and I would like to thank and congratulate all the contributors. Then to your question, just a precision, I don't have the exact figures here, but there are 2 armed conflicts, international armed conflicts are identified, but there is a series, if I remember well, 9 situations of occupations. We also trigger IHL, and probably the number in 2014, I haven't looked at the RULAC new database because I was busy today and looking forward.
But you mean the concept of conflict has extended to occupation?
It has always,
definitely.
It has always included the occupation, but there are a series of occupations. Actually, the most spectacular of 2014 is Crimea. And if you look at the situations of occupations, you have a series of, I would say, recidivist states which occupy parts of other states, and naturally Crimea is just an addition to Russia occupations of Transnistria and of a part of Georgia. Then back to your question on Mexico, one of the things, and coming back to the war report, it links facts to legal provisions and shows where things are disputed, where things are established. One of the, and sometimes takes position, try to take positions. For instance, the threshold of violence, which leads to qualification of international conflict, by contrast with internal violence or disturbances, etc. And for Mexico, naturally, the event very tragic event. We don't know everything about this event, and probably our colleague will be able perhaps to say something about the tragic event which happened very recently. Probably is an element on the discussion, but it doesn't fundamentally change the assessments we are doing on this conflict. I remember last year, my colleague Andrew Clapham was in much better situation than I am, because when you asked the question, he was just coming back from Mexico and had this discussion with very, naturally, well-informed people in Mexico, which is not my position. So I just observe that the idea that there is something like a non-international armed conflict in Mexico has spread since last year. It has not been, it's still not accepted by everyone, naturally, but it becomes more and more obvious. Okay.
And Isabella, I said, in the remarks that, of course, this report helps us media people to understand better what's going on. How does such a classification help you, the legal persons, and how big of a help is it in your daily work? I mean, who cares? You care, but the people you're talking to, do they care? Does the report bring something new to them in terms of good news for them or bad news?
Well, I think it helps a lot, at least the people working in humanitarian organizations, and this I see in my daily work, especially because I'm working with an organization that engaged armed groups. So at least I would say that those people who are working in humanitarian situation need to know the legal framework applicable. And so for them, it does make a huge difference whether international humanitarian law is applicable or not, because then it changes on what basis they can engage the actors, and especially armed groups, for example.
Do they accept that framework?
The humanitarian organizations?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
But the people you're talking to, the armed groups?
Well, the armed groups, it depends. Sometimes they have problems because, as you said, or Ambassador Schmidt said before, the problem is that states will often deny that they find themselves in a situation of armed conflict. So, in fact, states will use the wrong framework, or at least another framework, and then the armed groups will find themselves in a difficult situation where, in fact, they don't exactly know what they should apply. And this will be problematic. So therefore, I think it's very useful to have not only a website like this, but also researchers that clarify the applicable legal framework, which is, by the way, not only IHL, but also human rights is applicable in armed conflict situation. I think it's important to remind that.
Okay, you refer to some state. Let's talk about Syria. Is Syria ready to accept the fact that there's a war in Syria? I'm talking about the ICRC. At first, Syria would tell the ICRC, this is not a war. President would say, I do have a problem with a bunch of terrorists, but there's no war going on in Syria. So does that classification help you now?
Good evening. Thank you for the question. And indeed, Syria has a problem.
Among other problems, the problem of definition of what's happening in your own country. Yeah.
Today, Syria is the worst humanitarian crisis happening worldwide. If you look at the number of displaced people inside Syria because of the armed conflict, 6.5 million people. If you look at the people, refugees outside of the borders of Syria, about 3 million people in neighboring countries. And it's typically, and that's maybe one contemporary characteristic of non-international armed conflicts, it's the regional dimension of such armed conflicts. And so it affects not only the territory of the concerned state, but all neighboring states. If you take the example of Lebanon, for example, they have 1/4 of their population in Lebanon is made of refugees. Which of Western states will accept to have 1/4 of its population made up of refugees? So we have to commend Lebanon on this. Is it helpful to classify as non-international armed conflict situation in Syria? For humanitarian organizations, yes, it is, because we are clear on the frame we are going to work in, and we are clear in legal arguments we are going to invoke to back up our representations, be it on protection issues, on detention issues, with the Syrian authorities. Syria is maybe not the most difficult context where you have challenges about classification of situation. As far as we're concerned, as soon as there's a big disagreement about the legal reading of the situation, we must put these disagreements on the margins because we want to be able to carry out humanitarian activities. So at one stage we want, okay, let's put these legal controversies aside and let's work.
How can work be proceeding? How can you actually work when you're not talking about the same definition? You mean the people you're talking to and yourselves?
Most of the time, because we are good at what we are doing, and we are...
There's no doubt about that.
And because we are working with the national societies in the concerned context of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, states and all parties to the armed conflict accept humanitarian activities because it's helpful for the civilian population. So most of the time, a legal disagreement does not hamper us from carrying out activities.
On that subject, I'd like to have your point of view, Christoph Haynes, about, well, execution, extrajudicial executions, what's happening now in Syria, and how are you trying, not even before solving the problem, how are you trying to know exactly what's going on? How do you get your information? How do you know what's going on in the first place? I've always been very curious on that subject. It's probably a fascinating work, but how do you do that?
Yeah, I think for any international organization and the kind of mandate that I have to get the information is, of course, a difficult issue. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, I have the invitation to go to Syria for some years now, but in practice, it's not something that will materialize, I think.
At the moment, you're still asking, and they're still refusing?
No, there is an invitation that came out earlier. But to follow up on that invitation and really to be able to go, I think it's the same with Iraq at the moment, that the security situation is just so that it's probably very difficult to, at least in the individual cases that one wants to investigate, to be able to go there. So the mandate that I have, you mentioned Mexico, for example, before, and other states that I've been able to visit, there it's possible to go and have an on-the-ground assessment. I think to a large extent, many of us rely, of course, on the kinds of figures that come out and that the High Commissioner for Human Rights and that they try to give context to, and to be able to say, are we at 80,000, are we at 100,000 people who have been killed, and of course drawing then on the involvement of the other organizations and the figures that and the estimates that one can get from organizations such as the ICRC. Those are largely in terms of information, the information that one has to be able to respond to as well.
Okay, but the field of your own investigation is just huge. Extrajudicial executions, that goes from what's happening in Syria, what the US drones are doing maybe in Pakistan.
Yeah. Are
you in charge of that too?
Yeah, so drones is a large part of my mandate, also the mandate on counter-terrorism. And from both mandate sides, we follow the drones issue quite closely. Of course, Pakistan is one of the major issues that we look at in terms of the use of drones. What Ambassador Schmidt mentioned earlier, the classification of conflict is very important in that particular case as well, to know what is the legal framework, the threshold, how permissive is the legal system, international system in terms of the use of force. If it is an international armed conflict, of course, certain standards apply to a large extent, but somehow differently with non-international armed conflicts. But of course, if it's human rights, which is the perspective that I take for the largest part of Pakistan, in terms of the permissive framework for the use of force, it's the human rights framework, which has a very high threshold for the use of force. Imminent threat must be established. And that is, just by the way, why I think publications such as this is so useful, because it really maps the world in a way that it's almost like the Google kind of map thing, where one is able to say this is a speed limit in this part of the world, 60 kilometers or 80, 120, whatever the case may be. It's not the final word, of course, but it puts it on the agenda, which then is a starting point in terms of when one can say when is the use of force permissible.
Okay, so fact-finding is one thing. difficult work, we all assume. But then when it goes to preventing or trying to prevent those extrajudicial executions, how do you work and how do you convince the people you're talking to, even in New York or in Geneva?
Yes. Well, I think on different levels. So one is that from my mandate side, for example, I have 2 opportunities per year to submit a thematic report. So, for example, I've submitted reports on drones and the legal framework for drones. Also on autonomous weapon systems in the Human Rights Council. And of course, that's to some extent controversial because it's not just a human rights issue, it's also an issue that is dealt with within the disarmament context. But I think these reports can be useful in terms of establishing the debate, in terms of defining the framework, and in terms of trying to at least establish to what extent is there consensus on the law and identify the areas of uncertainty and perhaps make some suggestions about that. The other aspect is, you mentioned Syria, for example. So, for example, I had the opportunity to address the Human Rights Council about Syria and ask for a referral to the International Criminal Court, for example. So I think those voices, of course, these are voices. It's not in any way binding, but I think those voices add perhaps to the global emerging consensus on these things.
Okay, we'll have a chance to talk about Syria and what's going on, the executions, the videos that come in free of charge. Remember, this is delivered free and with our colleague from Al Jazeera English. But just before, let's go not to the ICC, to the office of the prosecutor of the ICC. Okay, now, does that help you? Same question. Does the classification help you in trying to nail the criminals wherever they are? Sometimes you are being asked to do this. Sometimes maybe you do it on your own. The council, the Security Council, has the mission to ask you what to do. Could you tell the audience several maybe different cases? How does that work in the office of the prosecutor? How do you decide that someday you are going to investigate in that field, either because you are being asked to do so or because you feel like you should do so?
Well, I think that, well, sure, I thank you for the multiple clarifications that I'm not representing the ICC, but only the Office of the Prosecutor, probably. Your question involves 2 dimensions. The first one is how do we receive situations, and how is the jurisdiction of the court triggered in macro terms, so to speak. The second question is how do we select within a situation which cases we are going to investigate and prosecute. And there are two different questions. The second question is guided by the prosecutorial discretion and prosecutorial strategies. The first one isn't. The first one is guided solely by the statute and the mechanisms that can activate properly the jurisdiction of the court, which is a Security Council referral, a state party referral, or those situations where we, proprio motu, determine that a certain situation involving a state party or nationals of a state party intervening on a non-state party have committed crimes within the jurisdiction of the court, and that no national authority is effectively investigating or prosecuting those crimes. That is a legal determination. And on that one, we're not guided by policy considerations. If Central African Republic, as it just did, refers the situation of the Seleka and anti-Balaka violence, as it did with a second referral of Central African Republic referring itself to the ICC, our interpretation of the statute is that if all the requirements of jurisdiction and admissibility are met, we have no discretion. We have to open an investigation and we have to move forward.
So there's no question. At that time, you say, yeah, all the requirements are met, so we do. That's
what the statute establishes.
Okay.
There is one possibility that we could, and it's highly exceptional, that we could decline to open an investigation, despite the fact that a state party has referred itself or a non-state party has accepted our jurisdiction, if we conclude that opening an investigation would not be in the interest of justice, including the interest of victims. We view this as a highly exceptional situation. To date, this has never happened. And what we have also made clear is that for us, the interests of peace are not the interests of justice. That there are actors in the international arena that are there to look after the interests of peace, but that we do not consider, for instance, the fact that there is an ongoing peace process as an obstacle that would basically impede us initiating an investigation.
But do you understand that there is some criticism on that point of view, peace, justice?
Well, it's a very old discussion. I mean, it's not a new one.
It started even before the ICC
It's a discussion that predates the ICC,
undoubtedly,
and it's a discussion. When I joined the ICTY back in 1998, which is my point of entry to international criminal justice, if you want to put it that way, and the ICTY had just delivered its indictment against Mladic and Karadzic, and there were a host of voices.
Who was that again? Sorry.
So the first indictment against Karadzic and Mladic.
Oh,
Karadzic,
so
perhaps
sorry,
the main two
understand.
actors in the Republika
okay.
Srpska, and the two actors behind the genocide in Srebrenica, among other horrible crimes. And there was a host of voices being extremely critical, telling the Office of the Prosecutor, acting in a completely responsible manner, there will never be peace in the former Yugoslavia, and peace should come before justice. And I was already heavily involved in the drafting of the indictment against Milosevic for crimes committed in Kosovo. The reaction was, again, the same indignant reaction. You're jeopardizing a peace process, and besides, you're never going to get Milosevic in the same way that you're never going to get Karadzic, and you're never going to get Mladic. Well, there was peace in the former Yugoslavia. Milosevic died in a prison cell in Seveningen, and Karadzic and Mladic are now currently facing justice in The Hague. And I, for one, think that all those are very good developments.
Very good. And Isabella, on the legal point of view, justice, peace before justice, justice before peace. How big of a debate is it? Is it a daily debate for people like you?
I would tend to say, as a lawyer, that for me justice comes first, and I don't think, in fact, that those are two opposing notions. I think that peace without justice will not last very long. So I think that it's rather political leaders that would oppose those two, but the civil society, I don't think they really disagree that justice must be done. And so in that sense...
But there are cases where there's neither, no peace and no justice either. Yeah, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes.
You have a comment on that, Robert Rogue?
That's not a comment, but no, it's a comment. I'm a criminal
lawyer.
Go
ahead, you're free. I mean, this is a democracy.
I'm a criminal lawyer by training. I would just like to add that justice doesn't mean only criminal justice. Don't forget that justice is also economic, social justice. And that's a mistake which is often made. And there are too many expectations towards criminal justice.
Okay, we're talking about classification of conflicts. We're talking about policies, justice. We do have to talk about foreign fighters. It's in the report about the use of force, the need, that'll be interesting, the need for maybe new laws, international humanitarian laws that could apply to all sorts of situations. We're talking about lack of governance. So we do have quite a few more subjects to talk about. But I'm going back to our good friend from Al Jazeera English. We were talking about executions. We were talking about Syria. Okay, let's face it. We have videos coming from Daesh. I said free of charge. This may hurt your conscience, but of course, as you know, it is important. All those pictures are free, available to anyone. They're pretty well shot. They're pretty well edited. They're available. Do you broadcast them? Do you broadcast those pictures of executions? In Europe, there's a tendency to use some of those videos, and this is a very hypocritical, decision. How far do we go in broadcasting those pictures? We do not broadcast on Swiss television the act of death itself. So what? We very often broadcast the picture. What if there's a hostage that all of a sudden speaks French? Is that more interesting because he speaks French than if he were speaking English? This is the subject of very long and difficult discussions in all the newsroom. How is it with Al Jazeera English?
It's in general, we have to be aware that media could be a weapon of war. And now it's used more and more as a kind of participant in war. It can contribute in crimes. It can spread terror as well, or horror, in fact. And we have to be aware of that. Media and television organizations or newspapers shouldn't fall in that trap. They have to be very mindful of not being used by either a government or a group in order to spread its propaganda or message. It has to evaluate it and put it in context. Concerning videos coming from Daesh or Al-Qaeda or whatever, there are two things about them. One is the news value, and the second thing is what is the message that these groups want to transmit through different media. They have social media as well. Concerning Daesh and Al-Qaeda, we took the decision lately, before we were thinking about these videos, what carries the news value in it. For example, a French hostage, as you said, it can be a proof of life, that this person is still alive. We make sure of what is the date that video is recorded, what is the circumstances around it, and that could be comforting to the family. But we don't broadcast the message he says, because he is not free in what he is saying. Recently, we stopped completely airing any complete video, and I would say any video from ISIL or Daesh, because the way they are using media and production is actually to spread their message from terror to horror, and therefore creating an effect in the battlefield, on the ground, and within population. It's subduing the population in this case. So mainly we might broadcast a still coming from this video to say that this, for example, hostage or whatever is threatened by this. And that's a decision that we are sticking to despite any other competitor or what they're doing. It's a very, very careful decision that we are sticking to.
Very well said, but Salah, I have a very nasty question for you. Suppose the leader of Daesh, Abu Bakr, sends you a tape, a videotape. He's not a hostage, he speaks freely. Will you broadcast that?
For a videotape, we'll have to examine what he says. If it carries new information, enlightening to his point of view or his practices, background of his character, then we are going to take these excerpts and put on air and put them in context as well with analysis and expert views about them. But if it is pure propaganda, then we are not going to broadcast them. I prefer to do an interview with him, and any media person will do an interview with another party in a conflict.
Well, we had the same conversation about bin Laden. If it is an interview, yes, television people will agree to do that. If it's just a message, no. I mean, how do you expect any videotape from a leader of Daesh not to be propaganda?
I'll give you a personal experience. Al Jazeera itself has done interviews with Osama bin Laden, and that was acceptable. To do an interview, you can challenge him, you can probe him, or whatever. That's back before 11th of September.
Yeah,
I think
that was the only ABC
after.
News and Al Jazeera were the only one to have a real interview with bin Laden before 9/11.
Yes.
Right.
After 9/11, well, I wasn't with Al Jazeera after 9/11, but we still received few tapes after attacking Cole, the destroyer in Yemen, and then the whole Al-Qaeda became completely outlawed by everyone. He sent tapes, and a lot of them were carrying a lot of propaganda. 60 minutes tapes, maybe they have poems, they have whatever. What we broadcasted maybe was a couple of minutes in which he either explained a process of action or gave a threat to some country or declared the intention of doing an action which is of news value and will be beneficial to people to take care, for example, or to understand what's happening around. So that's the way we value and judge what we broadcast or not.
So how do you assess that? I mean, does in your daily work, does it help you that the media sort of follow what you are trying to investigate and denounce? Or would a complete silence help you or make any difference?
No, I think the media is very important in terms of spreading the message because as I've referred to earlier, the work that we do is not binding in itself. It depends on impact that it has, and for that one needs the media. There's something else that I want to add to that, and that is the role that information and communication technology plays. Comes back to your first question about the sources of information. Sri Lanka was a good example, the end of the war, where footage came out, which was largely cell phone footage, and a number of us were involved in analyzing that, getting experts to then eventually be able to tell the Human Rights Council that these are real executions that are depicted in those videos. Now, I think a number of lessons one can learn, that I learned from that process, is that it's hugely, I think, important, and is going to be much more important in the future as well, that this kind of material, whether it's CCTV cameras, satellites, this is coming out, and we saw that with Palestine, and we saw it in many different places, how that comes out. Now, I do think there's a challenge for the international human rights and humanitarian law community to deal with that material, because if some of that material comes in and you rely on it, and you go to the council or you go to the ICC and so on, and it's disproved, then the entire system loses its credibility. So it seems to me that it's important that whether it's within the UN or it's the UN with some allies, the industry perhaps to some extent, that some kind of institution or institute for verification of this digital material is established. Because I think if individuals such as, in my case, my predecessor, in my mandate, and myself, we identify people to ballistics experts and so forth to work with us, in the first place, they may be targeted and be subject to reprisals themselves because they sign off in their own name. But if it's the institute that signs off, it's much more difficult to attack those individuals. So I think that to me is the first point. The second one is that it's very difficult for somebody in a mandate such as myself to know that this is the expert or this is the expert that I should have. So if there's an institute where you've got the different things, for example, the recoil on the rifle, is it a live round that was used, the metadata, if those things can be authentically investigated, I think the integrity of the system will be. But at the moment, I think we need to think more carefully about how to approach this topic.
Okay, we're talking about material executions, torture. I'd like Stéphane Ojeda to go back to, of course, what was the news last night, the Senate report on torture. Well, of course, we're talking about armed conflicts, we're talking about war, violence. Well, torture is one thing that, of course, everybody, I hope, in this room is likely to denounce. Now, how does it feel to see that a country is likely to adapt to the situation and be democratic as far as, having the report published throughout the world with all the consequences that it may have? And we all know, of course, what the work of the ICRC in that field with Washington has been very difficult. How long did it take before the ICRC could actually go to Guantanamo? Could you recall us that?
The first day after it opened, so right away. But the detainees we are talking about in this Senate report, they were not in Guantanamo, they were in the CIA secret detention program, and we did not have access to these detainees. Only when they were transferred in Guantanamo Bay in September 2006, we managed to have access to them. So during all the period of the detention and the CIA jurisdiction, we did not have access to them. Now, you were mentioning war and torture. Torture is prohibited at all times, peacetime, war, non-international armed conflict, international armed conflict, at all times. But suddenly, and no society, I think, is immune from that. Suddenly you have a big security threat, or it's interpreted as a big security threat to a state. And you see everywhere this reopening of debates about, well, maybe in that case torture would be justified. Maybe we could have, not torture, but enhanced interrogation techniques. And no society is immune from that. And it's terrible because torture is prohibited and it's a legal matter. But what we learned from this report, from the Senate as well, is that apparently some ex-interrogators, some professionals are telling us that, well, when you do torture, the information you have is not really crucial and is not really saving lives. It's a lie. So it's really problematic, and we have to keep pushing that torture is prohibited, and certain techniques. Usually we don't want to enter into certain techniques of interrogation, but we had to do it when it came to waterboarding, because that was a main debate for years. And we went public and we said, look, waterboarding is torture. And people were surprised, wow, the ICRC is saying such a thing, and big thing, because usually we are confidential, etc. But this, we could not remain silent, because we do not want this silence to be construed as implicitly cautioning this kind of interrogation technique. So the second part of your question, yes, it's great that a society decides to look back, and the Congress, the Senate is looking at techniques employed by the CIA from 2001 to 2006, and what we have here is not the full report, it's the executive summary redacted by the CIA. So it's great, we have truth, but only partial truth, because the full report will not be made public, and we have an executive summary of 500 pages, the same as war report, that's the norm, redacted. So we'll see what will happen next.
Okay, but the fact is, for several years, the US government ignored all the Geneva Conventions. So we're talking in the report about what IHL can do, what cannot do. So for 5 years, they ignored international law, saying this is war on terror. War on terror. The concept does not exist on a written page.
Exactly.
How did you have to
that's
face
part of
that?
the problem, where the Geneva Conventions really is a legal framework applicable, because even the US Supreme Court in 2006 in the Hamdan case said, well, the war on terror, legally speaking, it does not exist. It's a rhetoric, it's a political statement, but don't turn this into a legal thing, because it does not exist. You cannot be at war against terror. And our position was, you can fight against terrorism. We're not saying that you cannot defend your citizen against terrorism. You have a duty to do so. But when you do so, there are some rules of the game to respect. And you have to check and to have a case-by-case approach. And you will see, when you fight against terrorism, are you involved in an international armed conflict? At the time, in October 2001, in Afghanistan, it was an international armed conflict. So yes, the rules of international armed conflict were applicable. Maybe in your fight against terrorism, you will be involved in a non-international armed conflict, and then it will be another set of rules applying. And maybe you will do diplomatic measures, or you will freeze some assets. It has nothing to do with war, and it's not the laws of war applying, it's another body of law.
Okay,
so we disagreed with this global war concept, and only the laws of war apply.
But I'm asking all the members of the panel, don't you think that more and more states, nations, and not only armed group are saying, oh, fine, the conventions, the Geneva Conventions, they're great, but they do not apply here. Isn't that something amazing, that this seems to be, getting worse and worse? You have the right to take the microphone.
Thank you. Well, this is why it is important to remind that human rights law is also applicable. And it's even more stringent in that time. So sometimes states don't realize that they rather argue that IHL is applicable than not, because sometimes human rights law is less favorable to them than IHL is, especially with regard to conduct of hostilities. So I think in that sense that there is not enough, although it raises perhaps other questions, but there should really be now a reminder that there are, in situation of violence, that there are international norms applicable, and especially human rights law. So when states say, yeah, IHL is not applicable here, then okay, fine, but there are other frameworks applicable.
You, in the report, you wrote quite a few pages about the Republic of Central Africa. Is international law, humanitarian law, applicable in that country? When we see the pictures on television, we feel like there's no law at all. Point. Same in RDC.
Central African Republic was a case at point here. It was very interesting because, in fact, there was there was a very high level of civilian casualties. And this is where perhaps it was difficult to know at what point IHL was applicable or not, because there are in fact two conditions for IHL to be applicable. Not only you need to have very high level of casualties, but you also need to have a sufficient level of organizations of the armed groups. And here, during the whole year of 2013, there was huge doubts whether or not the groups in question were sufficiently organized in order to apply IHL. So, and at the end of the year, then the UN Security Council made a statement that in the legal community, we all thought was not quite correct, and that in fact IHL was not really applicable at the time, despite the very high level of casualties. So we were left with the framework applicable, which was only human rights law. And the other problem that this raises is that there is now a big debate whether or not armed groups are bound by human rights law, which is rather a legal debate than a really humanitarian law, let's say, than a practical one. But still, it was a bit complicated at the time. So yes, Central African Republic, I think here it was, the legal dimension of the conflict at the end was a bit circumvoluted, and perhaps that was not the main issue. The main issue was really how to save the lives at stake there.
That's right. I'll go back to the ICRC representative, but Christophe, you want to elaborate on this?
Yes, just very briefly. And so you ask whether things are getting worse.
Whether
things are getting worse worldwide in terms of adherence to international law. I think perhaps one thing to keep in mind is that there's a growing body of research that says if one looks at the number of people who die violent deaths at the hand of other people, whether homicide or in armed conflict, that may have gone down actually for the last 4 centuries or so. So I think and that's ongoing research now. But I think what's important of that research to me is to say one should be careful about, in a way, a despondent kind of approach where we say things are getting worse, especially if one is, in a way, the way the media works, of course, is such that it focuses on the exceptions and that captures the imagination, and it may create a certain picture. So, but having said that, I think at the same time there is the danger of radicalization of ideologies. I think there's also the use of technology that poses threats that need to be managed. You mentioned drones.
New weapons as a whole. Right?
New weapons, yes, and with biotechnology and all those possibilities. The possibility of targeted killing across the world opens up, it makes it so much easier for states to cross borders if it's an unmanned system that they use or if it's high technology that they use. And that poses a danger that we may be moving to a situation where the war is always the exception, but it may become the norm. Low intensity, targeted killing. Those are challenges that I think that need to be addressed.
Great, but another question to all the members. Who is likely, or which world body is likely to write or rewrite international humanitarian laws that would be applicable to new situations, the new situations that we're going through? Whose job is this? Whose job is this to write or rewrite?
It's not mine.
Thank you.
It might be yours one day. My take, if you allow me, is to say that before we think about rewriting the laws of war, let's start by applying those already existing rules. That doesn't mean that they are perfect. Of course, there are certain areas of the law that need clarification, that need strengthening, that need development. I fully agree with this. But I would be cautious in reopening completely the whole thing and restart from scratch. If the main cause of suffering in armed conflicts today is because the applicable rules are not applied, that would be my take.
Okay.
I agree with you 100%.
Go ahead,
Say
Sela.
something more, that the semantics play a big role here. You said targeted killings. If we call them assassinations, they will fall under existing law, regardless whether they were done by drones or by rifle. It's old kind of assassination.
Extrajudicial. executions. That the words speak for themselves, but that doesn't help. What about the IC? What International Criminal Court? Go ahead.
When you ask who's responsible for reading it correctly, I think that basically what you have is international. You have a system of international law.
A little closer to the mic.
International law that basically is composed by multiple actors. I would say the responsibility is everyone's. I think that from my side, a particularly important role is international courts and tribunals. I think international courts and tribunals and the case law that emerges from those fora is particularly defining, and I think in a number of ways it has operated as a safeguard or as a barrier to some of the negative developments that have taken place in the last 10 years that you were referring to, and it has conversely promoted the use of IHL and human rights law in a different way. For instance, the customary character of Common Article 3, the Geneva Conventions, was doubted a number of times until in 1995 you got the ICTY coming with a tariff jurisdiction decision saying everything that is banned for international armed conflicts has to necessarily be also prohibited in non-international conflicts, and it kind of killed the discussion. I mean, from there onwards, I mean, basically no one is doubting anymore the fact that in non-international armed conflicts there's a lot of things that you simply cannot do. That is no longer the sort of free range of states. And I think that similarly, the existence of a rich body of international criminal jurisprudence on the contours of the crime of torture has been extremely helpful to counter efforts to dilute what is torture and to call torture something else. So I think that in that sense, that is also an important body to look at, well, who has to read it right? Well, those guys certainly had to read it right because a lot depends on how that jurisprudence evolves.
Okay, I think we all agree in this room that the change of nature of those conflicts, makes it a little more, even more difficult to first cope with the problem and then, of course, trying to solve the problem. One question to Salah about the media aspect. Some of those conflicts are just not being covered by the press anymore, for several reasons. One reason is money. Let's face it, money just is not what it used to be, even in Switzerland. So we do have a problem sending teams everywhere. That's one question. The second problem is security. Who is likely to send a television crew these days in Syria or even in Iraq? That's one thing. But the fact that there is almost no witnesses, does that mean that we accept the fact that we do not have independently made pictures of conflicts, or not only television, but written press? Do we have to accept this as a fact?
No, and I don't think the media have accepted that yet. There are difficult situations. Media, all parties in conflict are trying to control the message. It's either by hosting you and embed you, or by preventing you. And now the trend is becoming more and more preventing you. For example, I'll just mention something that happened to us a couple of days ago. We broadcasted a documentary about death squads in Kenya. We got eyewitnesses who participated in that. Some of them admitted to commit extrajudicial killing. Now the Kenyan government is persecuting Al Jazeera. They're expelling or working.
Now that the president is free, I mean, with any prosecution, he can do whatever. He was free, but I mean, there's no more charges or anything, so he can really nail you now. He has plenty of time to do that.
The president is still on trial.
Right, you're right.
But then in few days, maybe, or weeks, we'll be out of the country, will not be allowed there, and if we work there, we'll work illegal. What message does it send to other media organizations to do that? Another difficult situation is in Egypt, for example. In Egypt, we reported both sides of the story, from the side of the Muslim Brotherhood as of the government, but then we were considered as a media organization to be an enemy of the state. And then the journalists who were working very objectively were imprisoned and been tried and actually sentenced in a very fast trial. And Syria is the extreme, ISIL is the extreme way of controlling the message, because just to enter there and be declared a journalist, you are almost committing suicide. But then we are still sending people to Syria in areas that are not controlled by ISIL. And if we have the opportunity and security enough to send people to cover what's happening, we do hit and runs. You can enter the regions which are controlled by ISIL for a short period of time, talk to few people, film, and then get out. But this is not the complete picture for sure. But then to have the nearest picture to possible, you have to get eyewitness accounts as well as ISIL messages, as well as people who were there and went out. So there are several ways of doing that, but not the real first-hand reporting.
Let's talk about the foreign fighters problem, because of course this, I think every country in the world has to deal with this. Even Switzerland, France, Belgium have a lot of foreign fighters. Who cares in terms of solving the problem? Does that make any difference? You see extrajudicial executions made by a young guy from France, from Spain.
Yeah, I think as you say, it's a really a problem that affects the world. I think about half of all the members of the UN are to some extent involved through their nationals being involved. Of course, the Security Council resolution on this, just I think in September of this year, starts addressing this issue. Previously, the focus was largely on the provision of funds, but now it's the movement of people as well, and the prosecutions of people who go for training or to go for participation. I do think that is a positive development. There's also, of course, the possibility that people, when they return, and that's a difficult issue because in a way you want them to get back from where they are, but if they do return, the blowback potential, the possibility that they may be prosecuted as well if their particular states are party to the Rome Statute, and they can be prosecuted in terms of that. And I do think that is because of the importance of accountability. I think this new Security Council development is an important development to start addressing this.
Anissa, we can watch all the different capitals, and we clearly understand that all the nations, even in Europe or the United States, they don't know what to do in terms of prosecution with any type of returnee, any type of foreign fighter going back to their own country. What do? We, as a community, what do we do with those young foreign fighters if they come back? Now, I don't know if you've noticed, but from what we know, not very many come back for several reasons, including executions. We know for sure that there's been a video about 10 days ago of this man from Franco in Senegal, in France and Senegal, saying that all foreign fighters that would want to go back to their own country would be executed. So probably, and let's be very cynical, that solves part of the problem. But in terms of prosecution, again, national laws may not be adapted to bad things being done so far away.
Yeah, in fact, well, I think 2 weeks ago there was a very interesting policy briefing by the Academy on foreign fighters and international law. But I think that perhaps, well, from a legal point of view, and I'm not an expert here, I don't think there might be too many problems in prosecuting your own nationals for a crime committed abroad. But I think perhaps what is the most disturbing is rather the societal problem, the fact that those are young fighters, those are young people. I'm not sure of the figures, so I don't exactly know whether they are below 18 or above 18, so that is a problem with regard to recruitment of
age.
Of recruitment of children in armed conflict situations, and it is a problem also because it's a voluntary implication of those persons into the group. So this we see not for example, with regard to foreign fighters joining ISIS, but there are many armed groups that are faced with this problem where you have young people wanting to join, and this is exactly the case of what is happening in Kobane now. You have many young people who want to defend their cities, and they got implicated in the fight with the groups, and it's quite difficult to regulate this, not only from the group point of view, but also from an international law and rather societal point of view. How we do with this, it's very delicate, I think.
Okay, before we go to the audience and let all those people ask plenty of questions, may I ask each member of the panel to sort of sum up what he or she retains from this discussion? Have we improved the discussion, the facts with reading regards of this report? Do we feel a little more, learned tonight?
Definitely yes, because we have been tackling different topics, contemporary topics in contemporary armed conflict situations. Any initiative, any project, any idea aiming at spreading knowledge of international humanitarian law, at enhancing the faithful implementation of international humanitarian law is to be welcome, and we welcome the new edition of the War Report. That does not mean that we agree with all the legal classification you find in there.
You should have said that before. That would have been interesting.
I was waiting for that. But we definitely welcome it, and it was very useful to have this debate. Yeah.
Thank you, Stefan. Fabrizio Gariglia?
Yes, I think when I first managed to get the report in my hands and go through it, one thing that I found very, very impressive was the multifaceted aspect of aspects you have touched upon by the report, the variety of issues and sub-issues ranging from the long criminal responsibility to the much more, if you want, sociological aspect of sexual violence against men in armed conflict, which is an often overlooked issue in terms of victimization. And I think that's when you look at war and war crimes, and when you have been working on that for a while, you see the complexity of issues involved, the range of different areas and different topics. And I think that this panel, in a way, is interesting in that sense. I mean, that we have a bit of everything, a bit of IHL monitoring, a bit of analytical perspective, extrajudicial executions of the UN system, media and reporting and monitoring and witnessing war crimes happening in real time, which I think in that sense matches nicely, the report and help us understand better this type of phenomenon.
Salah?
I think the report is very important for me. It gives me more information about what's going on in the world, although we have first-hand information as well, but that's complementary to it. And there are two very important points there. One is about the rape of men and boys in war. And I think this is neglected by most media organizations. People don't know about that in the world. It's not reported. And the other thing is about the right of people with disabilities in the situation of war, which also is very underreported. And that has to come to knowledge from people. And that might help in easing their problems, which is...
Yeah, you're right. Some of those sexual violence, is never mentioned. And we do have to take that into consideration. Anissa?
I feel I'm not very partial here, but
Don't say that.
No, but I do think that the book, of course, is very interesting and has a big value added. Not only the book, but also the website. Why? Because not necessarily for scholars, but really for humanitarian organizations other than the ICRC, because the ICRC, they have their own legal division that do this assessment. But other organizations, such as Geneva Call, but others as well, need this information.
Right.
Sometimes they don't know where to look at. And in our own report in Geneva Call, the war report is cited all the time as an indication of when we have a situation of armed conflict or not. And so I think this is a very important tool, and very useful for many humanitarian organizations.
Well, I'm sure Robert Roth agrees with that.
Unlike Anissa, I'm very impartial. No, but two things. On the substance, one issue we haven't addressed, perhaps it will come in the question, is the responsibility to protect and the importance of classification and qualifications in order to trigger the responsibility to protect. I will not speak about this now, but it's a very important part, and there is a very good essay in the book on the responsibility to protect in relation with the classification. The second point, under a broader perspective, it's a scientific, quote unquote, scientific book. What does it mean? I don't like neutrality and objectivity in science, because no science is neutral or objective. It's only a question of methodology and submitting the methodology to public debate. This book and everything we do at the Academy has a methodology, displays this methodology, and submits it to a public debate. And then you can discuss the methodology as well as the results being naturally the consequence of the methodology.
Thank you. Christoph Haynes, you have the last word on this panel,
yes,
before the questions.
Thank you. By the way, the chapter on the responsibility to protect I particularly enjoyed as well. Yes, I agree essentially with what has been said, that it's a very useful tool because it tries to cover the whole world, because otherwise one gets the view of a particular state that may have an ability to influence public debate in a way that may be out of proportion to the impact that the rest of the world should also have on that debate. I think there's incentive for states with high technology to argue that there is an armed conflict in a particular situation, lower threshold for the use of force, and that they may have incentive to also categorize those who may be targeted and talk about signature strikes and those sort of things, to lower the standards that hold them back in terms of using lethal force. And if you only look at it from a particular state's point of view, that's one aspect. But if you look at it comprehensively, you get the sense that you must really have something that is universally applicable, and that states can live with. I do think it's very useful as well that it's a legal analysis from political science, which obviously in its own right plays a big role, but there's often a different categorization. But the consequences are quite far-reaching of saying this is an armed conflict or not. And from the legal point of view, I think it's very important to have this sort of analysis. Just to perhaps say that since I'm not directly partial, I would certainly think you opened with Mexico. I would certainly think that one would need to think through the consequences of say, the classification of Mexico, say 100,000 people since 2006 killed, and of course the implications that it's not necessarily that a criminal intent may often be behind the organization and so forth. But of course, for those who argue that Mexico shouldn't follow a militaristic approach, that they should demilitarize their policing, they should demilitarize their justice, one needs to think about that, the implications of that particular classification as well. But I do think the report puts that on the table, and then the debate can go from there.
We'll see what happens in Mexico if they demilitarize the police. That's one question. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now the floor is yours. Would you please identify yourself, and please keep it to a question, no long statement. Your turn will come. Someday you'll be on the panel. So, one question, and I don't know if there's a microphone sort of circulating. Yes, this gentleman here, he was the first one to raise his hand. Yeah, it's really eager to ask questions. It pops up like that. He's been waiting
for this presentation. It was very interesting.
Get the mic a little closer.
It was very interesting. I'm Gilberto from Mexico City. I'm a federal police in Mexico, so I disagree a lot.
Are you being demilitarized, or do you have carry weapons?
I have nothing with me. I'm sure about this.
I'm sure you don't.
Allow me to disagree with you, Robert, because I think that at first there is not an international consensus about what is an armed conflict. But by the other hand, there is not a war or there is not an armed conflict in Mexico because there is a legitimate police force that is against drug cartels, and this is, I think that this is something that a natural and ordinary responsible from the government to tackle organized crime. I mean, and that's it. Could you elaborate more? Why do you think there is an armed conflict?
Go ahead. It's in the report. It was last year too. It made big news last year in the media here about the Mexico issue.
I'm really not a specialist in Mexico. I never had a foot in Mexico, so I've never been to Mexico. So perhaps some people, especially my Latin American colleagues, would be better in answering. But just to apply the criteria, it's more or less the same criteria as with a very different situation, very different background as in Colombia, where we have a fight between the government and two armed groups. And it's qualified, and I think there is no debate on this, as to separate non-international armed conflict. The question is whether, first, it's an organized, one of the parties, not the state, the other party, is organized, and second, if the threshold of violence is reached. On the first part, naturally, the information is not easily available, I guess, because the other part is a criminal group. So is it sufficiently organized? I wouldn't try to give an answer to this. And on the threshold of violence, naturally, it's an ongoing assessment of what is sufficiently violent in order to qualify for non-international armed conflict. These are the two criteria. As I said, we put the methodology on the table, which is not original. It's the accepted methodology in qualifying for international or non-international armed conflict. And then we apply this methodology. If you don't agree with the methodology or with the criteria, then we can discuss on the criteria. If you don't agree with the facts, naturally, we are not on the same level because I don't have enough information without being a specialist of Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question anyway, because it was very interesting to have also the answer. Gentlemen, there, and after, sir, right after.
My name is Abdulhai Sayed. I'm a Syrian lawyer, and as you would imagine, I'm a bit affected by many of the things that you have talked about, including about the non-referral of the ICC, of the Syria situation to the ICC court. But I'd like to go to a technical question which has to do with the classification. And from 2012, the situation of Syria was characterized as one involving a non-international armed conflict. What we have today is the international coalition action, which in fact raises the question. You have two situations which are at play, one that is international and the other is domestic or non-international. How does this sort of juxtaposition of situation on the ground plays out in terms of the thinking of which set of rules to mobilize in specific circumstances in the conflict? Thank you. I guess this question is really directed to Professor Roth as well, but welcome, Adaro.
You're really famous tonight, huh? I mean, you're the one here.
It's a very easy question. No, my assessment, but perhaps Adisa in particular will supplement or disagree. With the intervention of the US-led alliance and with the intervention of Iran, naturally things are changing. For me, the question is whether you can consider that there is some kind of consent by the Syrian government to this intervention. If not, I would not see the reason why not to qualify it an international armed conflict. The other part of the conflict is naturally a non-international armed conflict because I think, as far as I'm informed, that the involvement of the states which support the rebels is not enough in order to link the action of these rebels to this or this state. That would be my short answer, but perhaps Anissa can, or somebody can complement.
Please do. Thank you.
I have nothing to complement to your position, which I totally agree with. Perhaps well, one thing that we can say is with regard to the rules applicable, and this is something that sometimes is not always easy for some people to understand, and by I mean some people is like, for example, the groups or people implicated in the conflict, is that in fact, if we are facing an international or a non-international armed conflict, we have almost the same rules applicable in terms of customary international law, and at least the rules on conduct of hostilities, and of course, principle of distinction, prohibition of torture, so on and so forth. There are some areas which are more complicated in non-international armed conflict, especially with regard to detention. So in reality, in terms of the applicable law, it does not make such a huge difference whether we categorize this as an international or a non-international armed conflict.
Just one point of...
Yeah, it's
perhaps one point of clarification of what would happen if the situation was ever referred to the ICC, and as you correctly pointed out, there were efforts at the Security Council level to, which Syria not being a state party would be the only mechanism available to activate the jurisdiction of the court. But in that case, we would see it as a single situation, as the term of art in the case law of the court is the situation of crisis, and we'll be looking equally at crimes committed by governmental forces and crimes committed by rebel forces. And there may be, as it happened in the context of the former Yugoslavia, that what the situation of crisis is a situation that is complex in the sense that it involves aspects of international conflict and aspects of non-international conflict. Or in the case of the former Yugoslavia, you had international conflicts, internationalized armed conflicts, plus non-international conflicts, all in the same situation. So that can also happen. But at this stage, I think that basically there is sufficient legal knowledge and know-how to discern these situations. And I echo what Anissa said. At the end of the day, the difference is not that significant. At times, in the context of the Rome Statute, there may be some difficulties because the list of prohibited acts in the context of non-international conflicts is shorter. And for instance, certain critical aspects of criminality, like indiscriminate attacks against civilians, are criminalized for international conflicts, but not for non-international conflicts. Prohibited weapons, the lists are not symmetrical. But we have learned to sail through these waters. I mean, so it's not a situation where the office of the prosecutor will be seriously hindered by the fact that the conflict is non-international in nature or an aspect of the conflict is non-international in nature.
You're a good sailor. Another question, Monsieur? Please.
Yes, thank you. Michel Monod of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation. I admire very much the efforts, jurisdictional efforts, you make for mitigating war, But when I see violence now occurring in those armed conflicts, I doubt it's really possible to restrain violence, And so my question is, would it be possible on a legal basis just to prohibit altogether war? And to improve some more nonviolent conflict resolution, and to have some professional who would really deal with conflicts and on the basis of a prohibition, legal prohibition of wars.
Well, then who would be there to emphasize that and make sure it does happen? I don't know. This is a really huge question. Is any of the member of the panel?
One thing one can say, but Mr. Prosecutor would tell it better than me. There is a major step taken 2 years ago, 3 years ago, by criminalizing the aggression. So it's not in force yet, but in 2017, I guess, it will be ready. It was already in the Rome Statute, but it has been naturally formalized in Uganda, and that's a kind of criminalization of war.
Any war.
It's an interesting story, the resistance of the crime of aggression in the context of the Statute of the International Criminal Court, because there were multiple efforts to ditch it during the negotiations leading to the adoption of the Rome Statute. There was really a final push by Germany with the like-minded countries and civil society that managed to, in the 11th hour, keep the crime of aggression, but subject to a subsequent negotiation in terms of the elements of the crime of aggression, because that's one crime that has been traditionally non-defined in its contours. And I think that the expectation of many was, well, that negotiation is never going to take place. So the court will never exercise jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. And to everyone's amazement, as Robert says, in the first revision conference of the statute, the elements were agreed upon. And now there is an equally slow and painful mechanism to activate the jurisdiction of the court in terms of the crime of aggression. But I think that, probably in 2017, 2020, something around that time, the court will be able to exercise jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, which is no minor. I mean, it's not perhaps exactly what you want, but it's a step in the right direction.
Another question. Go ahead. The lady all the way up there. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you. I'm Carla Yip. I'm a PhD student at the Institute. I want to follow up on the last question, also about criminalizing war, for instance. I believe that the question was probably prompted by an impression that we sometimes have that IHL has certain legitimating effect on war. For instance, one of the statements made in the opening address was that IHL would authorize what is prohibited under human rights law in terms of, for instance, killing civilians as collateral damage. And I believe that statement, we are obviously, in a hall full of people who are interested in this kind of issue, who research and work with those issues. I believe that statement is something that a lot of people would dispute. Bill Bars would disagree. A lot of people would actually disagree with that statement. I wonder, and to pick up on the last question, I think that the relationship between human rights law and IHL is one of those things that people tend to associate it with the sort of pacifist movement or the legitimating effect of IHL and its authorizing effect. I just wonder, in your preparation of the war report, what is the editorial positions that you take? Do you sort of delve into these, meta-theoretical debate, or even at a more methodological level, how do you reflect the different views on these, sort of controversial issues within international law? Thank you.
Well, I'll let somebody in the audience answer that, and of course, that's the chief editor of the war report. So, Stuart. Right there, would you please answer that question? Thank you very much.
Well, I'll do my best. I didn't actually understand half the question. For a start, I don't even know what meta-theory is, so I can assure you there's none of it in there. Nor am I a pacifist, so there's none of that in there either. What I hope is in there is an impartial view of situations as classified under international law. That was the simple objective of the war report, to identify situations of armed violence that fall within the criteria as best we know. And that's, as a number of speakers have mentioned, there are areas of debate. We've highlighted them in the report. There are areas where people can have different views. And we've given our view, and other people can give their view. What I hope we've done is set a baseline, identify situations, give our views, as Robert said, identify the methodology, the criteria that we use, and then after that, it's for people to make their own decisions. Thank you.
I believe Stefan Ojeda has another comment to make.
I understand where you come from. In an ideal world, I would totally agree with your statements and with your question. The truth is, with or without IHL, war have been ongoing. It's not that you put it as IHL was a kind of legitimizing wars. With or without IHL, wars have always been here, and they will, I'm afraid, remain. So what IHL is trying to do is to frame, to limit somehow the impact of these situations to on the victims. That we reacted, IHL reacted to the most ancient social phenomena of humankind, which is war.
Another question? Yes, sir. Right here. Just right, this one. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Camilo Pantoja. I'm from Colombia, and I wanted to know if you have any comments on the Colombian peace process and this debate about justice or peace, because it seems like international regulation can eventually get in the way of some arrangements.
You're eager to talk about Colombia.
I think it comes, yeah, it's addressed at me, even if you didn't say it. Well, as you know, we're actively engaged in Colombia, and we have been engaged in Colombia very strongly for the past 3 years, I would say, since the 2012 preliminary examinations report on Colombia, and we have been working in what is at times not that easy, but I think that overall very productive relationship with the Colombian authorities to push for the effective investigation or prosecution of certain classes of international crimes, including the grave crimes committed by the FARC, which among others include massive instances of displacement of the civilian population, plus extensive sexual violence, just to name some of the ones where we have identified gaps in the reaction from the national authorities. Our position has been very clearly in terms of the current ongoing peace talks that we obviously support the peace talks, and that we want to be a partner of Colombia in the peace process, in the same way that we supported the justice and peace process, even though that basically was criticized from outside the court and from inside the court. Our position was, listen, we are flexible. I mean, what you're imposing as the maximum sentence for those paramilitary commanders who come out and give information and confess is frankly the minimum that in my jurisdiction you would get for simple homicide, right? It's 8 years. And yet we thought that the process was a viable process, a meaningful one, provided a measure of justice to the victims, provided some measure of punishment that was significant. And if anything, what we did was to push the national authorities to do a better and more extensive justice and peace process. Now, we have also drawn a couple of red lines, and we have said, look, if your peace process is going to be structured around a promise of impunity, that is inconsistent with your duties under the Rome Statute. We didn't force you to join the Rome model. You chose it. There are some very clear indicators as to what type of justice you have to deliver under the Rome Statute. It has to be criminal justice, and it has to be criminal justice with a punitive component. Mm-hmm. And there is room for flexibility, but blanket suspended sentence for everybody is not an option. And your constitutional court in Colombia said that we were right. Clearly said for those most responsible for the worst crimes, there cannot be impunity and there cannot be suspended sentences. Now the question is moving swiftly to the issue of alternative sentences. And again, what we will say is, listen, there is we're not going to be dogmatic. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. You have a range of perpetrators of these crimes, and you will have some more latitude in the lower echelons of that spectrum of perpetrators. As you move higher up, you will have less flexibility, and when you get to the top responsible, the top commanders who order the worst crimes, you can't say that, you know, community service is okay for persecution, murder, or torture, or sexual violence at that scale. Mm-hmm. So what we thought at the end of the day is, look, I mean, you want a sustainable peace, a peace that is consistent with the elements of the Rome Statute. There is flexibility. You have to be creative, but there are limits to your creativity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's the waltz that we're currently dancing, I think, with the national authorities. I think that pretty much is an open process. We'll see what happens. But at the end of the day, one important point is the court does not adjudicate on a model in the abstract. We will adjudicate on specific cases. So if at the end of the day what happens is, you know, our analysis is that Commander A is responsible for brutal massacres, and those the worst crimes that basically we have identified, and he's the most responsible for those crimes, we will analyze what the national courts are doing with Commander A. And if we are satisfied that it is a meaningful, legitimate national process aimed at establishing the truth and punishing the perpetrators, even if it's not what we would have done, we will defer to it. Yeah, right. But if it looks like something that is like, frankly, I mean, we're trying to get this thing out of the road as quickly as we can, and Commander A is going to be, sunbathing in San Andres in a month's time, then we have a problem.
Okay, we just need to know who is Commander A now. We're sort of running out of time. It's getting late and dark. One last question, the lady. Sorry for all the others, but we could go on till midnight. That's right. That's right. That's right. It was very interesting about Colombia. Very, very interesting. Madam.
Thank you very much, and good evening. I'm representing the permanent mission of Ukraine to the United Nations here in Geneva. Taking an advantage of having also distinguished panelists here with us, I cannot but ask about the situation in Ukraine in terms of what is going on there, in terms of its classification, and also taking into account the theme of our panel today, armed conflicts and their consequences. I would ask what their consequences might be in terms of this situation when we are dealing with one of the party of this conflict, which is their Security Council permanent member. Thank you.
Who is willing to answer specifically about Ukraine?
Only 2 words, and I will not speak for the ICIC. As far as I know, the ICIC has not considered yet that it was an international armed conflict, but I stand to be corrected. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty has issued in September declarations that it was an international armed conflict for 2 main reasons, obviously. First of all, the control of Russia over the troops in eastern Ukraine, and perhaps now the involvement of Russia in the fight. That's the situation as it stands, it seems to me, according to what I've read. Perhaps on the ICRC position, because I read something which was issued in July, if I remember well, which stated that it was international armed conflict. By whom, I don't remember exactly, but perhaps you can supplement.
Do you wish to do that on Ukraine?
Well, so far it was okay, and the last question. Maybe more.
It's not easy, I understand that for sure.
Maybe you ask as well about the humanitarian consequences today. Well, winter is coming, and a lot of people, in particular the most vulnerable people, remain on the hot spots because they are unable to move. So they are on the front lines, and we have a winterization program to assist them with various assistance. Another big issue is that apparently Ukraine has withdrawn as well a lot of public services in the areas controlled by separatist groups, and that's a huge matter when it comes to public services, when it comes to orphanages, when it comes to detention places, hospitals, etc. Well, people are left alone over there. So we are dealing with this. In terms of legal classification, it remains confidential.
Okay, this is the last comment. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you. I want to thank the members of the panel. But before you leave, I want to give you the biggest piece of information and news of the day, which will be worldwide in the papers and on television tonight. Listen to this. The Prince of Monaco, Albert of Monaco, and his wife Charlene have twins, a boy and a girl, Jacques and Gabriella. I'm sure you wanted to share that with me. Thank you very much.